is Mubilu Musoke. This time, I'm not going to talk about democratization of Africa, the case of Uganda, in comparative perspective directly, but indirectly. I'm going to revisit a review of Sowing the Mustard Seed, written by none other than Yoweri Kaguta Museveni. It is important for us to understand the ideas and the theoretical, the ideological, the philosophical, and the conceptual ambiguities which we find in Sowing the Mustard Seed, because they explain Museveni's politics. And now, having seen what is happening in Rwanda, the dispatch of secret service to assassinate political enemies adds to the urgency of understanding the mind of a dictator and how they operate. So this particular review attempts to plug and hopefully to seal the factual, the theoretical, ideological, and philosophical gaps in Sowing the Mustard Seed. We want to look at the consequences of Museveni's politics as viewed from his own words, which he wrote in his book, his autobiography, Sowing the Mustard Seed. The primary objective of this review, therefore, is to expose the numerous hidden contradictions, the theoretical fallacies, and the philosophical ambiguities, and what I call ideological paradoxes, which we believe are ultimately rooted in Museveni's enigmatic personality. One good lesson we learn from reading the Sowing of the Mustard Seed carefully is that the personality of a leader can play either a positive or negative role in the process of democratization of a new political system. This is an important factor in politics, which is ignored by political scientists who are primarily concerned with the policy analysis, and the jurists who focus on the legal doctrines, principles, and rules embodied in constitutions. They overlook the character and the personality of the players in the political field. We must not only study the processes, but also the individuals who animate these processes. We should remember that the greatness of a leader, and we just lost one in South Africa, depends on whether his contribution to society is positive. Positive contribution of a leader to society is largely the result of the personality of the leader. Unlike historians, the political scientists and jurists make their judgment of a leader's contribution based on the contemporaneous actions of the leader. It takes a while, often at least one generation, for history to catch up with the political deception perpetrated by a political leader in order to determine whether the leader made a positive or a negative contribution to society. In the case of Museveni in Uganda, in sharp contrast to Nelson Mandela in South Africa, for example, the verdict is now clear. The impact of Museveni's leadership is a negative one, and to a great extent disastrous because of Museveni's corruption and fanatical greed for power. The two factors which, in retrospect, have aggravated his failures. Ironically, Museveni's legacy on the history of Uganda is not unlike that of the two brutal dictators he fought at the beginning of his political career, namely General Idi Amin Dada and Dr. Milton Obote. Like Amin and Obote, Museveni has brutally suppressed political freedom, grossly violated human rights, and viciously victimized his political opponents. Some of them are dead. Unlike Amin and Obote, however, Museveni, to a great extent in his imitation of Julius Nyerere, initially used a corrupted Marxist social theory to rationalize and justify his dictatorship, entrench his corrupt regime, and deceive both his admirers and the opponents alike. Although, unlike the humble Nyerere, the arrogant Museveni posed as an intellectual giant who he was not. Museveni, it turns out, is a perpetrator of theoretical fraud on top of other forms of corruption. The invalid theory he wrote was designed to achieve political fame and not provide intellectual nourishment to academia or explain the nature, the causation, or reality of social change and democracy in Africa. As he claimed, the invalidity of Museveni's social theory is now too obvious to serve its author's original political objectives of elevating him to greatness in African history. In fact, for all practical purposes, the theory has been discarded and abandoned by its author, leaving NRM as a political organization an orphan, stuck in an ideological vacuum. Our general objective in this review, second look at Museveni's autobiography, is to expose the fallacies in Museveni's theory to social metamorphosis, on which his cunning politics was astutely constructed but erroneously rationalized and will ultimately be destroyed. Hopefully, those who sang or even still sing in unison NRM political songs of unity and the virtues of a broad-based government, praising Museveni's leadership, will learn a lesson from Museveni's mistakes exposed by reviewing of sowing the mustard seed. Political deception may pay big dividends in the short run, but the political corruption which it produces is ultimately exposed and often severely punished by history. A corrupt leader may mislead people for a while, but he or she cannot deceive history. Facts are philosophically indestructible. Facts may be misrepresented, hidden, or otherwise falsified, but they cannot be destroyed. It is one of the functions of history to discover facts objectively and thereby reveal the true story recorded in history and the past reality of a specific society. The duration of life is both finite and contingent on many factors. Dictators do not know this fact. If they do not understand it. Historical facts cannot be undone. Museveni's story is a good example. It is too late for anyone to salvage Museveni's legacy for posterity, such as he might have blindly yearned for greatness. Museveni's political fate was already sealed by the time he ran for the third term, which he procured fraudulently. Museveni should have listened to his childhood friend Elia Tukahirwa Kategaya between 2003 and 2006, before Kategaya himself succumbed to the vicious whims of the dictator. Every day Museveni remains in power, unfortunately, his grave gets deeper because, as history has taught us, the personality of a dictator is ultimately programmed to self-destruct. Personality is destiny, especially in politics, democratic or dictatorial. Dictators, however, like all types of addicts, rarely recognize the excess in their actions until it is too late. Fortunately for history, it is the excesses of a dictator that seal his fate forever. It happened in Germany under Hitler and Italy under Mussolini. This is why a comparison of Yoweri Museveni in Uganda with Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, Fidel Castro of Cuba, and late Julius K. Nyerere of Tanzania is an important educational exercise. It gives us a new dimension of knowledge to understand how history, politics, and personality are interwoven. Such knowledge is beyond the political science and jurisprudence as currently constituted. The curricula of both subjects will have to be radically revised in order to keep up with the new trends of knowledge. The comparison of Museveni with his political heroes is part of the conclusion of this review, which completes the portrait of the mind of Uganda's dictator by looking at other dictators who have formed the inner circle of Museveni's political heroes. It is ironical, but not surprising, that Nelson Mandela, one of the greatest leaders to walk on planet Earth, is not one of Museveni's heroes. What explains such an obvious blind spot? The explanation seems to be that Museveni detests to be overshadowed by great personalities. Mandela is not corrupt. He was very honest, and he was principled and democratic. Museveni and his heroes are the opposite. So, as they say, birds of the same feather flock together. Now I look at the mustard seed. Most of the ambiguity in sowing the mustard seed is the result of excessive use of common political terms loaded with unnecessary ideological content and political baggage. The purpose of this seems to be to allow Museveni, consciously or unconsciously, to be all things to all people. Many political terms are concepts, and the concepts are not defined and are in fact undefinable in the text of the sowing the mustard seed. But they are used extravagantly with the meanings that shift or change with the emotions they convey, deliberately or otherwise, by a specific political context, within a specific context in the story. Examples of the root terminologies we intended to examine and use for illustration of conceptual ambiguity in the sowing the mustard seed are the words reactionary, revolutionary, ideology, and sectarianism. Obviously, these are not scientific terms, whether used by Museveni or anybody else. The importance of these terminologies or concepts is the fact that they are woven into both Museveni's social theory and his historical biographical narrative. Museveni, for example, uses these terms to describe people or events he likes or dislikes. The social theory was, for example, used to animate and legitimate Museveni's politics, especially in the Constituent Assembly debate of 1994-95. To make ambiguity compounded, the four root terminologies of political concepts are almost always combined with a suffix, a prefix, or an adverb that underlies or intensifies the ambiguity and the political message conveyed in the different contexts of the text where they are used. We have countless examples from the text to illustrate the conceptual ambiguity. First, we look at the word reactionary. The word reactionary, for example, seems to be the epitome of political evil in sowing the mustard seed. It is reserved for negatively labeling Museveni's worst political opponents. Museveni, for example, refers to reactionary forces in Uganda, who he denigrates using such derogatory terms such as sub-imperialists. The Baganda are they are not only reactionary forces, they are also, in sowing the mustard seed, sub-imperialists. Other reactionaries are the members of UPC. Museveni regrets that, quote, "It was tragic to see incapable reactionaries taking our country towards civil conflict while thinking they were being very smart," unquote. Other reactionaries in sowing the mustard seed are the Acholis, quote, they actually, after the coup d'etat against Obote in 1985, imagined that they could invite the NRM to be co-opted into this reactionary grouping. And quote, political organizations Museveni personally disagreed with are labeled reactionary. Museveni, for example, writes that during the anti-Obote struggle of 1981 to 86, we had the same problem with the Amini groups, such as the Uganda National Rescue Front, UNRF, led by Moses Ali, and other reactionary groups, for example, the Uganda Freedom Movement, UFM, and Federal Democratic Movement, FEDEM, which were trying to use the Baganda on a sectarian basis. These are words of a man who supposedly, honestly presided over the so-called broad-based government. Museveni later on called the same people swine. A reactionary is clearly an individual whose politics Museveni disagrees with. It is subjective and abusive label. How can it, therefore, be possible for a leader to genuinely and honestly deal with individuals he refers to as reactionaries in the so-called broad-based government? Here we see deception and revealed. Museveni is not now, and in 1986 was not, honest. Objective history should avoid such subjective labels because they are meaningless in the long run. However, in the case of Museveni, they are very revealing. The other terminology he uses, of course, is revolutions and revolutionaries. Apparently, the opposite of a reactionary in sowing the mustard seed is the revolutionary. The term, as used in the book, is given a positive connotation as compared to the negative, obviously politically detested reactionary. The term reactionary, nevertheless, has no clear definition, even though it is sharply contrasted with revolutionary. Any person or organization opposed to NRM policies or beliefs earns the title of a reactionary, even though the spectrum covering all those opposed to NRM policies or beliefs is very wide, thereby stretching the ambiguity of who a reactionary is. Surprisingly, the term reactionary, though positive, revolutionary, though positive, is in Museveni's subjective understanding of politics, does not appear as extensively throughout the text as the other three terms or concepts. The explanation seems to be the fact that Museveni's political world, in Museveni's political world, there are very, very few revolutionaries. Revolutionaries are very rare in Museveni's world, just like Museveni himself and his personal heroes, Muammar Gaddafi, Julius Nyerere, and Fidel Castro. These are the true contemporary revolutionaries during Museveni's political career. The political implications of this association are obvious. To be a revolutionary, You must believe in a certain ideology, which Museveni believes in, but strenuously refuses to acknowledge publicly. That is another aspect of political deception. No wonder revolutionaries are showered with praise. For example, Museveni writes that, quote, the Tanzanians, for their part, were hesitant to fight us during the Bush War, that is 1981 to 86, because they knew that we were a serious force of dedicated revolutionaries, and this presented them with a dilemma, unquote. At no point in the book are the Tanzanians described as reactionaries, even though at various points in Museveni's story, the Tanzanians were clearly opposed to what Museveni and his organization from NASA were doing. The hint from Tanzania, the Tanzanian case, is that the terms reactionary and revolutionary are actually ideological labels with the opposite meanings. They have little, if any, objective historical meanings in Museveni's story. They are not scientific terms, even though they are used in Museveni's social theory of metamorphosis discussed in another part of the review. The next time we encounter the term revolutionary is at Museveni's swearing-in ceremony on January 29, 1986. The context is self-explanatory. Quote, in my address to the nation, I made three main points. First, I explained that this change of government was a fundamental revolution and not a mere change of guard. Our thinking was radically different from previous regimes which had been sectarian, a neo-colonial presiding over an economy which was not properly integrated, unquote. Those are Museveni's words, not mine. The term revolution also appears when Museveni meets Mobutu on the same day after his inauguration. Quote, perhaps he, Mobutu, was worried by the example, by our example, the people of Uganda overthrowing the established order of by a popular revolution, unquote. Besides a popular revolution, whatever that may mean, there is also counter-revolution. When NRM assumed power in January 1986, Museveni and his colleagues automatically ceased to be the insurgents. Those who had been in power in turn became the insurgents. Museveni writes about one of them. He, Lieutenant Colonel Oduo, was eventually killed at Conakry in January 1987 when he became the counter-revolutionary insurgency armed of opposition which had started in 1986, unquote. It is obvious that when the NRM insurgents won the war, they blessed themselves with the term popular revolution, but due to conceptual ambiguity inherent in the term, it is unlikely that Museveni would apply the same term to another victorious insurgency other than the NRM. But during this time in the bush, during their time in the bush, the insurgents Museveni never referred to his men as counter-revolutionaries. These terms are therefore inherently biased and ambiguous. Their use is always political, ideological, and subjective. Inevitably, these terms end up robbing Museveni's story of any authenticity and objectivity. Now we look at ideology, a term that appears far more frequently than either reactionary or revolutionary is ideology. Museveni seems to have fallen deep in love with the word, with the concept ideas.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Mubilu, and good morning, KB, the engineer. We thank you so much for your untireless, efforts to come to the show. Let us not come the air, let us know what's going on, how we can rescue ourselves from dictator Museveni. Mr. Mubilu, what you've said so far is right on the money, and as everybody knows, we have a big problem on our hands. And hopefully, this will come true as the U.S. predicted, that this will be the year that Museveni is going to have to leave power. We hope it comes true, and we are going to put fire under his feet, especially Federalist Alliance for Development and Democracy in Uganda. The reason why I called is to talk about this dictator Museveni, who said he cannot sleep over Sudan, that he has got sleepless nights over Sudan. Fellow Ugandans, we have a maniac in Uganda as a president. This is the man who told us that he brought us sleep in Uganda. And he wanted us to sleep and sleep and sleep. It is funny enough that at this moment, he's not sleeping. He says he has sleepless nights over Sudan. How can someone who goes to sleep cannot find sleep to sleep himself? We have a major problem. The man was not elected, or the man did not shoot his way to power to take care of Sudan. Not to sleep, not to lose sleep because of Sudan. He should be doing this over Uganda. As the previous call said yesterday, that Museveni thinks about Uganda when he's asleep. Now, we know the man who goes to sleep to Uganda to sleep cannot sleep because Sudan cannot sleep. So where are we left? We have to get together to get this maniac out of our system. Not only Museveni himself, but we have to dig the roots of Musevenism and uproot the tree with all its roots. Uganda is the way it is because of one man. This man has said over and over without shame that he has been fighting for 50 years. You tell me, go back 50 years. That's about the time Uganda has been unstable. And as we've been saying, everything has changed. The only constant in Uganda's misery is Museveni. Uganda has been unstable since independence. And the man has been saying he's been fighting for 50 years. You go count how many years since independence. And when we tell people we have a problem, our country is the way it is because of one man, and people don't understand. People think we just hate Museveni. He cannot say he's been fighting for 50 years, and Uganda has not been settled since for 50 years. So, Mr. Musoke, what you are saying makes sense. The man is a killer. The man does not care. We had over 31 people killed by his forces in 2011. He never lost sleep. We had people killed in Kasubi fire. He never lost sleep. We had over 10,000 people killed in churches in Imbala or Chibweteri. The man never lost sleep. And now he's telling us he can't sleep. Well, it's time we made him go to sleep forever. Thank you so much, Mr. Mubilu.
You're welcome. Yes, well, To the caller, I thank you for that input. It adds to our understanding of the personality of Museveni, which I'm trying to reveal. The fact is that Museveni, on the one hand, he has a split personality, as they say. Split in the sense that on one hand, he wants to be seen as a leader, a great leader of Uganda. But at the same time, everything he does in Uganda it tends to destroy the country. He has not done anything that you can point to and say this is the legacy Museveni is leaving behind. He did not build the Owen Falls Dam. He did not build the Uganda House. He did not build the Mulago Hospital. There is nothing to point to. There's not even an infrastructure. When he came to power in '86, the train was running from Mombasa to Kasese and through Soroti to Gulu. But now there is no train in Uganda. The infrastructure is rotten, and there is no transport in the whole country. So one wonders, why is this guy in power? What is his objective? It is not to build the country. It is not to bring about progress and economic development. So why is he there? These are the contradictions I'm talking about, and which we should be able to explain. And some of these explanations, as I said, can be found in the terminologies Museveni uses in his book. A term that appears far more frequently, of course, is the term ideology. Museveni seems to, as I was pointing out, to have fallen in love with the concept of ideology. I don't know what the word ideology means for Museveni, because after looking at it, as I'm going to illustrate, one is left with the impression that he really actually does not understand what the concept of ideology is. In a recent speech read for him by Major General Wilson Mbadi in Kasese recently, Museveni said, quote, "Uganda now has a good army. This was a problem for the past governments because they did not know how to build it as they lacked ideology." Now, I want to repeat that sentence because of the word ideology. You figure out what he means by ideology. Uganda now has a good army. This was a problem for the past governments because they did not know how to build it as they lacked ideology. What on earth did Museveni mean when he used the term ideology in the context of the army? We can take this recent use of the term ideology to indicate that Museveni does not understand the concept of ideology. Even more important, Museveni does not realize that armies in democratic systems should never be indoctrinated with a specific ideology, which, since different political parties have different ideologies, politicization of state institutions, the army, the police, the civil service, is contrary to the basic tenets of democracy and democratization. So the term ideology, however, for Museveni, seems to be a double-edged political sword in the text of sowing the mustard seed. Those whose ideology is compatible with the Museveni or the NRM are good others apparently are evil. However, in the past, before they were politically purified, they were members of NRM with, quote, ideological limitations of some of the members of our external committees, unquote. There were people who are described in the book as politically incompetent, apparently because they are ideologically bankrupt. Those are Museveni's words. The DP leadership, for example, is described as one with, quote, ideological limitations of its leadership, unquote. And the leader of DP is described as politically and ideologically myopic person. Of course, the DP leader is referring to here is not Mao, is that one is Semogerere, is the one who is ideologically myopic, whatever that means. Obviously, these references in the Sowing the Mustard Seed, published in 1997, refer to Semogerere, and they're not Mao, the current leader of DP. So what does he mean by ideology? Some ideologies, apparently, according to Museveni, are better than others, something I find fascinating. The criteria for judging the superiority of an ideology seems to depend on Museveni's personal desires. Here we have cracked the riddle within which the enigma of dictatorship resides: intolerance of political views of others. For example, Kikosi Malam, or KM, Obote's army in Tanzania when he was in exile, UPC military wing when they were in exile, quote, had a pathological fear for NASA, precisely because they recognized our capacity to organize, our clean record, and our superior ideology, unquote. What superior ideology? Apart from political arrogance, it is not clear what criteria Museveni used to determine which ideology is superior to another. All ideologies are the same. They are frozen, dogmatic political philosophies. Once they are frozen, they cease to be rational guides of political action. About KM, the Kikosi Malam, Museveni further writes that, quote, our attitude to KM was readiness to cooperate with them, although preferably not to join them because of their wrong-headed ideology and methods. Wrong-headed ideology? What is he talking about? This event, that is of removing Zule from power, was brought about in essence by the undemocratic culture or ideology. The army had to be organized on the basis of ideology, according to Museveni. Museveni writes that it was especially important that the army, which was really a colonial relic, should be disbanded completely and a new people's army created on the basis of a new ideology of nationalism. Now here he is adding nationalism with the ideology, a new ideology of nationalism. New, not old, new ideology of nationalism. How can nationalism be new in any case? Nationalism is national. It's love for the country. It can't be a new ideology. The concept of People's Army is, of course, not original to Museveni. Museveni has never been an original thinker anyway. People's Army is a socialist communist idea. Is the U.S. Army less nationalistic than the Chinese Army simply because the Chinese Army is labeled or described as People's Army? So why confuse nationalism with, which is universal, with ideology, which is particularistic? The game of politics, in Museveni's view, is categorized and justified by the type of ideology involved or one believes in. According to Museveni, for example, political intrigues among politicians had to be weakened, so weakened the mass movements such as DP and UPC that Amin just picked up the mantle of power from a political leadership emasculated by its own ideological narrowness and its unprincipled conduct of state and political affairs. What is ideological narrowness? Ideologies have depths and width and height. This is incredible. It would seem that, according to Museveni, corruption only infects those who are infected already and incapacitated by bad ideologies and blind personal ambition. Evidence of extensive corruption under NRM in Uganda today notwithstanding. Corruption within NRM was extensively exposed by Human Rights Watch recently in a report. If ideology is causing all the corruption in Uganda, then such an ideology is not good for Uganda. Museveni, for example, seems to reflect, quote, my brief experience with the UNLF administration, in which I occupied senior positions as Minister of Defense and later Vice Chairman of Military Commission, which succeeded Godfrey Binaisa's administration, showed me that it is easy to create unity among the people, provided one has no personal ambitions of self-advancement. One is not corrupt, and one is ideologically clear and politically perceptive. Unquote. Those are Museveni's words. It's a jumbo kind of sentence. One wonders what it really means. Only God could accurately decipher the meaning of the latter sentence in light of all the corruption and the thirst for power widely reported from Kampala as late as 2013, many years after the publication of Sowing the Mustard Seed. Such statements are, however, quite revealing, much as they seem to be confused. They are revealing about the character of Yoweri Kaguta Museveni as a person. He wants to be everything to everybody. But worst of all, hypocrisy is masquerading as objective or even good ideology. Sometimes the terms personalities and ideologies are confused or even used interchangeably. For example, the DP was led by conservative men who had limited perspectives both in terms of ideology and models of struggle. In terms of ideology, they confine themselves to colonial or neo-colonial ideas. What does he mean by that? On the other hand, the UPC, quote, was largely composed of lumpen bourgeoisie. Ideologically, the UPC leaders were bankrupt. And as a result, they were certainly unequal to the task of national emancipation, unquote. What is he talking about? He has ruined the country, and he is talking about the task of national emancipation. He has destroyed, as one caller has just said, he has destroyed the country. He has not emancipated it. You don't destroy, you don't emancipate by destruction. It would seem, according to the last sentence quoted, that ideology by itself is believed to instill political capacity in the individual politicians. Generally, however, politicians at the time of independence were politically and according to Musoke, ideologically bankrupt. As we shall see later on, Museveni believes that sectarianism was responsible for causing what he says philosophers call ideological obscurantism, which means obscuring the truth in order to serve the interests of a clique. If that is true, does it mean that ideological obscurantism never infects or blinds NRM members? How do we explain Museveni's ideological ambiguity? To add confusion to ambiguity, Museveni believes that there is such a state of political affairs known as ideological underdevelopment that caused the political problems within UPC in 1964. My goodness. We know that economic policies in the modern political system are largely ideological in content. Museveni, however, seems to think otherwise, and yet Museveni's interpretation of the way the economy functions is very similar to, if not the same as, that of the communists and the socialists like Julius K. Nyerere, whom he admired tremendously, as he narrates the story in Sowing the Mustard Seed. In fact, Museveni cannot separate his understanding of colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism from ideology. Quote, when the European explorers first set foot in Africa in the 15th century, the natural process of growth and advancement towards higher forms of civilization was interrupted and distorted. This affected both the economies and the people of Africa. The dominant exploitative relations in production, distribution, and exchange were imperialist, capitalist ones, which have always worked to the detriment of the African people. Unquote. Now, that statement is very interesting because some of you may not be aware of this, but the Museveni is the supervisor at the University of Dar es Salaam was Walter Rodney, a very radical Marxist theorist who wrote the book called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. That seems to he seems to be reiterating that the concept of imperialist, capitalist intervention in Africa. However, according to Museveni, ideologies can also be personalized. For example, Obote's only ideology, quote, was and is power, and I recognized that in him, he writes. Because Obote's ideology was power, and Museveni argues that he, Obote, provoked divisions even within his own party, unquote. At a certain level, Museveni took ideology to be a personal quality of an individual, reflecting on his student role. For example, he remembers that, quote, our role in the student movement had three effects. It radicalized and deepened the ideological content of our thinking. It made us quite well known on the African scene, especially in liberation movement circles, and it reinforced our Pan-Africanist views and enabled us to make Pan-Africanist contact, such as President Nyerere, unquote. Then Museveni adds that because we were political active, our group attracted the attention of various communist regimes, which were keen to attract students to their side of the Cold War, which was at its height at that time, unquote. Now, Museveni denies being a communist, and yet he's giving us evidence that he was one at one time. In sowing the mustard seed, most of the time Museveni does not distinguish between a policy and ideology, inevitably leading to conceptual ambiguity. Nevertheless, sometimes Museveni distinguishes between a policy and ideology. Everything depends on context. Referring to political activities at the time of independence, he writes, the so-called party workers never had time to go down to the grassroots to do organizational work. Instead, they created hysteria, setting people against each other, polarizing them along the lines of their tribal or religious identity. There was nothing about ideology or policies, unquote. Museveni's policies in the army are a good example where no distinction between policy and discipline and ideology is made. Museveni writes that in order to build a new national army like ours, however, it is essential, first of all, to clarify the ideology of the armed forces and establish a firm code of conduct that will be respected and adhered to, unquote. In the previous sentence, there seems to be confusion between a discipline and ideology of soldiers. And yet Museveni comments that later on that previous armies in Uganda were brutal because they came from the colonial system, unquote. That is not true, because there is no causal relationship between the army having been colonial in origin and its being brutal. Museveni's army has brutally murdered innocent Ugandans in order to allow Museveni to cling to power. Does that mean that Museveni's army is of a colonial origin? Of course not. Colonial armies were disciplined, in fact. If discipline means strictly conforming to the rules and standards set by the commanders. The post-colonial armies became brutal after they were politicized or indoctrinated with specific ideologies. Politicized armies are the primary perpetrators of state terrorism, whether under apartheid, Idi Amin, Milton Obote, or Yoweri Kaguta Museveni. Dictators interpret the mission of the army as one of carrying out political orders rather than executing military objectives. Museveni's army today behaves in exactly the same way as Obote's army did in 1966 and 1980s, or Amin's armies in the 1970s, as the events of September 2009 and the election of February 18, 2011 clearly demonstrate. UPDF has partisan political objectives and not a nationalistic military mission. In fact, Museveni is proud of the fact that UPDF is politicized. But we cannot attribute the brutality of Museveni's army to colonialism. Museveni attributed the brutality of Obote's and Amin's armies to colonial rhetoric. However, Museveni's army is equally brutal as Obote's and Amin's armies. Everything depends on the orders given to the army and why the orders are given. Ideology is irrelevant under these circumstances. Later on, Museveni writes that, quote, ideological realization of where your fundamental interests lie is crucial if the mission is to succeed. This success depends on a clear understanding of the mission, both by civilians and soldiers, and upon ideological organizational discipline. Recruitment into the armed forces since those early years of NRM has been based on recommendations from local village councils and committees who must vouch for recruits' character and personal discipline. In this way, the recruiting team would only be concerned with health and physical fitness because the ideological and psychological factors had already been taken care of, unquote. How would the ideological factors be taken care of before the soldier is recruited through the recommendation of the villagers? This statement implies that ideology is either a personal quality or a cultural element shared by all the members of the society. And yet, clearly, that is not the meaning of ideology Museveni intended to convey. There may be multiple ideologies, but there is always one culture in a specific society or ethnicity. In fact, sometimes we refer to anthropologists, we refer to ethnicity as a marker of a particular society. When it came to dealing with the real ideological issues in organizing the economy, Museveni was either evasive or tried to draw distinctions where there were no differences. Museveni argued that, quote, we were able to remove the privatization and free market debate from the realm of ideology and show that it was part of the actual tactics of building the economy, unquote. Museveni seems to be claiming to possess a skill no human being possesses. How can anyone, quote, remove the privatization and free market debate from the realm of ideology? And privatization and free markets are concepts that are inherently part and parcel of the liberal ideology. In their essence, these concepts are by their nature ideological. They cannot be removed from ideology. The quotation above clearly shows that Museveni does not want to call a spade when it comes to his personal beliefs and ideology. Having been a socialist with deep faith in the virtues of state enterprises, Museveni found it difficult in the late 1980s and early 1990s to confess that economic policies that were forced on him by the IMF and the World Bank were actually not only viable but also truly capitalistic or liberal. Museveni's ideological ambiguity continues in spite of the fact that he has accepted capitalism as his political creed. For ideological and political reasons, especially his friendship with Julius Nyerere, Muammar Gaddafi, and Fidel Castro, Museveni does not want to be publicly identify himself as a capitalist. This is so in spite of the fact that Museveni and his family own extensive interest in businesses, obviously acquired corruptly. To some extent, this ambiguity both causes and explains the corruption under NRM regime. In concluding our conversation on Museveni's and ideology, we can say that Museveni's idea of ideology is not only misconceived but strictly personal. It portrays an inflated ego. Museveni treats ideology as a personal item, such as clothing. If you like the color of your clothing, you can call it beautiful. But if you must not be respectful of the tastes of others, do not abuse them simply because they prefer to wear the colors you do not like. That is the essence of freedom. Freedom allows individuals and groups to choose what they prefer. In the case of Museveni, when others choose a different color or ideology, it is equivalent to committing a crime. They become reactionaries or totally unacceptable in their political behavior. This personalized approach to ideology drains out its content according to one's preferences. This is not what ideology means. The American College Dictionary defines ideology as, quote, a body of doctrine, myth, and symbols of a social movement, institution, class, or a large group, unquote. This means that an ideology, like a religion, is collectively owned by the group who believes in it. It does not belong to an individual who unilaterally arrogates to himself the power to determine and define its content or what the specific ideology is, as Museveni does, for the sole purpose of serving his personal political interests. So, it is clear that by studying Museveni's views of ideology, we get deep into his approach when it comes to sectarianism. The next favorite political term Museveni loves to flip around is sectarianism. This term also contributes to conceptual ambiguity in sowing the mustard seed. This concept, which is both theoretical and political, enhances our understanding of Museveni's political theories, politics, and ideology, and later on. In his reflection on the war in Luweero Triangle, Museveni characterized UFM leader Andrew Kaira as a sectarian organization. Yeah. We saw earlier that the same organization was described as reactionary. UFM being sectarian, Museveni writes, came out during the debate whether the monarchy in Uganda should be restored. On his part, Museveni writes, quote, "We argued that we were fighting to restore power and sovereignty to all the people of Uganda, and that it would be up to them, the people, to decide how they used this freedom. If they wanted to restore the monarchy, that would be up to them, not us." And what? Strange. But those are Museveni's words. That sentence right there sounds untruthful. Museveni, it would appear to us, did not fight to restore power and sovereignty to the people. That is not what has been going, what he has been doing during the last 28 years. Prohibiting Ugandans to walk to work is not guaranteeing their sovereignty. Arming, recognizing, and creating Sabanyara and Sabaruri is not protecting the cultural values of Buganda. I'm not even sure Museveni knows what the term sovereignty and freedom mean. If he does, then he is the greatest hypocrite who ever lived in Uganda. More specifically, Museveni accuses Kaira of double-dealing during the debate they held in the bush. On one hand, Museveni writes that Kaira was openly supporting the restoration of the monarchy, but his true motives were to promote support for DP. Museveni then declares, quote, "In this way, in that audience, which was 100% Baganda, we were able to defeat this sectarian opportunistic group, this which in some fora would claim to be working for the Baganda and in another for DP. We defeated them politically without using any military means," unquote. Later on, of course, Kaira died by what Museveni himself calls military means. Museveni's argument does not sound genuine. First of all, most Baganda have multiple allegiances. They may believe in their political parties as much as they pay loyalty to the Kabaka. That does not mean that they are either sectarian because they advance the cause of their political party, or opportunistic because they are loyal to the institution of kingship at the same time. A conclusion that to that effect is either malicious, that is intended to malign the intentions of the individual, or a failure to understand the Kiganda culture and the behavior of the Baganda, or appreciate the very essence of the concept of freedom. One person can have multiple allegiances. The situation is not contrary to the law, and it is not sectarian. Another area where Museveni's political lenses focus on sectarianism is, of course, political parties. This issue is discussed in more extensively under the topic of Museveni's social metamorphosis theory, which we are not going to discuss in this conversation. In 1980, during the campaign for elections, Museveni, the crusader against the political parties, saw the political solution to his ambitions in forming his own political party. Quote, "So we formed the Uganda Patriotic Movement in spite of knowing that it would have a poor chance at the elections since issues were already polarized along sectarian lines," unquote. Museveni's attempt to portray the political parties in 1980 as sectarian is neither accurate nor convincing. We shall use his story to demonstrate the contrary. The alleged sectarianism within the political parties in 1980 could not have prejudiced Museveni in his political quest for elective office in Ankole, as he alleges. The facts are clear. Museveni himself writes that, quote, "Having belonged to the DP myself in 1960s, I had quite a number of friends who wanted me to join the DP. I did not agree to this, however, because I thought that uniting Ugandans was more important than electoral success. In this context, joining the old sectarian parties would have been the wrong move. Following the collapse of UNLF under UPC and DP pressure, I believed that the correct thing to do in 1980 was to abstain from both those parties," unquote. It is important to point out that Museveni did run for a parliamentary seat in 1980 elections as a UPM leader. He ran against the DP candidate Sam Kutesa and lost. Sectarianism did not play any role in Museveni's loss to Kutesa of DP at that time. First, both candidates were ethnic Bahima from Ankole, and both were Protestants. Therefore, neither religious nor societal, that is ethnic sectarianism, as defined by Museveni himself, played a role in the Museveni's loss to Kutesa, as Museveni would want us to believe. Even more important is the fact that anyone familiar with the situation at the time agrees that DP overwhelmingly won the election in 1980. But the results were rigged by Mwanga, who stopped the counting and changed the results and declared the result by proclamation. We discussed this issue sufficiently elsewhere in earlier conversations. When we pointed out in 1980 electoral fraud was an interventionist military coup d'etat sponsored by Julius K. Nyerere. Even more important, DP would not have won those elections on a sectarian basis due to the demographic factors. Catholics and the Protestants are almost each the same percentage of the population of Uganda, about 42% of the population. Therefore, neither religious group could have overwhelmingly won the election without the significant support from both religious groups. Museveni himself knows this fact. In fact, Museveni writes that DP was more popular than UPC in 1980 and would have won if the elections had been free and fair. That's Museveni. He writes in it, sowing the mustard seed. It is therefore seems that means that Museveni's theory of sectarianism is undermined not only by his own participation and loss to a DP candidate, but also by the general results of 1980 elections. In fact, the results of 1980 elections are good testimony to the fact that Ugandan society had undergone substantial change since 1962, when the last elections was held. It is also wrong to paint both DP and UPC as sectarian political parties in 1980 without looking at the sociological reality of the country, and more specifically the actual memberships of each of the two parties. These are facts which are verifiable by statistics. Both parties had and still have membership from all parts of the country, as well as all religions. They therefore cannot be accused of societal sectarianism. The charge of sectarianism in these parties is not only false, but purely dogmatic on part of Museveni. It does not reflect the sociological reality on the ground. Museveni, for example, writes that, quote, "Many people do not understand our aversion to political parties, but it is because of the history of sectarianism which these parties fostered in our society, mainly on the basis of religion," unquote. The fact that DP and UPC may have originally drawn the majority of their membership from specific religions does not mean that they were still organized in 1980 along the same sectarian lines. Social change has transformed both the political landscape and the political parties themselves, as it has done to all elements of the Ugandan society as a whole. Museveni is therefore wrong when he writes that we who had belonged to Fronasa did not see how the political parties could have brought peace to Uganda. They had been sectarian right from their very foundation, unquote. That is a dogmatic statement not backed up by statistics. Museveni does not cite any statistics to back up his erroneous hypothesis. It is also purely speculative and apparently prejudiced, founded on an invalid social theory of social metamorphosis. It assumes that, falsely of course, that the composition of political parties in Uganda was static or permanently fixed and was not transformed by social change. That would be contrary to the general law of history, which Museveni does not seem to know or even understand. No society remains static forever. In his dogmatic view, of sectarianism, as reflected in the two quotations in the paragraph above, Museveni does not seem to understand that social change is an inevitable historical force that constantly changes all elements within the society. It is important to point out that the clear distinction between social change and social evolution. The former leads to the latter sequentially in the long run. Moreover, Museveni's arguments are ambiguous. It is not clear whether he is talking about social change or social evolution. This is a clear when Museveni uses the analogy of metamorphosis of a butterfly, changing from an egg to a fully fledged insect. One wonders whether he is talking about social change or social evolution. However, the theory most analogous to Museveni's is the capital theory, as we pointed out earlier, is an evolutionary theory. It is therefore a mistake for us to equate Museveni's concept of revolution, the one he refers to in his inauguration as president of Uganda on January 29, 1986, with the concept of revolution in the capital theory. So no society remains static forever, let alone even in the short run. Among the sociological factors that had undermined ethnic discrimination in Uganda during the 1970s and 80s was the extensive involvement of Africans in operating business enterprises. I'm not arguing that the businesses themselves were a great success. However, the mere existence of ownership of a business has an impact on social behavior. In order for a business to succeed, the owner is forced to not to discriminate on any basis, especially religion, ethnicity, or race. This is a universal phenomenon. Racism in the U.S., for example, was gradually undermined by capitalism. It is still being undermined by capitalism. It is suicidal to organize any business on a sectarian basis. By attributing the demise of UNLF to both UPC and DP, Museveni is in fact seriously undermining his argument and therefore the validity of his theory. Quote, the demise of UNLF had been caused by the greed and intrigues of UPC and DP leaders. Opportunistically and unrealistically, each of the two factions had thought that somehow they would gain the upper hand, although that would mean dividing the country again along sectarian lines, unquote. This claim by Museveni if correct, means that the leaders of DP and UPC were playing politics like any other politician would. If the two parties were still staunchly sectarian in 1980, they probably would not have cooperated to bring about the demise of UNLF. The existence of UNF, like NRM later on, was incompatible with the freedom of association, which the political parties, especially DP and UPC, demanded at the time and later on under NRM. The demand was based on political principle to protect political freedom and not opportunism, as Museveni alleges. Therefore, sectarianism did not motivate DP or UPC to bring about the demise of UNLF. The main political objective of both parties was to protect and guarantee freedom of association. The leaders of both parties made this point very, very explicit. They argued and demanded that political parties had a right to organize and to operate independently as political parties and not to be forced to exist as dominant political entities under the UNLF umbrella. This is what Museveni feared most when he came up with the trick of the so-called broad-based government. In view of the fact that societies are constantly undergoing change, Museveni's poignant description of sectarianism in the political parties in the mid-1960s should not have been applicable to the political conditions of 1980s, almost 3 decades later. Quote, one of the fundamental elements which influenced our group in those days at Intare School was revulsion at the sectarian politics in Ankole, which comprised the administrative areas of Bushenyi, Mbarara, and Tungamo districts. The so-called Protestant faction was aligned with the UPC, and the Catholic and Bahima factions with the DP. These factions were formed by opportunists seeking public office they could use to accumulate wealth. In fact, Ankole was a microcosm of the sad story of political sectarianism in the war of Uganda. Therefore, our small groups stand against sectarianism and opportunism at that very stage in our lives, and also the Uganda's political history, was really quite remarkable. We started fighting these political ills around 1965. Prior to that, members of the group had been influenced by sectarian political parties like everybody else. Unquote. That's Museveni writing, falsifying political history. The points about social change argued above render the nostalgic reflection of Museveni out of date. We need to argue it further. We need not argue this point further. However, as we have already above these claims are most they are dogmatic than sociologically or statistically accurate. Museveni's youthful reflection on politics in Ankole, as he remembered it in the 60s, was not accurate 30 years later. It gives the impression that all Bahima belonged to DP and all Bairu belonged to UPC. Grace Vingira, a Mohima, whom he referred to in a different context above, was a prominent member of UPC and not DP, to which he claims the Bahima belongs. Bezo Bataringaya, a Catholic, a Mwiru, was a prominent member of DP before Obote corrupted him to join UPC. These two individuals had each a large following in Ankole. Therefore, Museveni's argument, even in the mid-1960s, is more dogmatic than scientific. It is not supported by statistical data. Such data is still available today. It cannot be changed by false claims or invalid social theories propagated by Museveni to deceive the people. Now, sectarianism in the army. Museveni argues that in addition to political parties, the army too was sectarian. But it seems surprisingly that sectarianism in the army was not of the same type as sectarianism in the political parties. Why is this? Sectarianism in the army was the result of three distinctive factors. These were first, the historical factor of the colonial security policy, under which the colonial regime deliberately recruited armed forces from minority ethnic and religious groups under the colonial state, under which colonial state terrorism was enforced through the punitive expeditions. Punitive expeditions, for those of you who don't know the history of colonial Africa, punitive expeditions were expeditions of soldiers who were sent to supposedly collectively punish a group for having been suspected of doing something wrong. It could be an attack, or it could be somebody murdered another person from another group, and then they send a punitive expedition to literally punish the entire community as a result of what they were suspected of doing. Second, the colonial policy was embraced and continued as public policy after independence by the post-independence regimes, which, like the colonial regimes, practiced state terrorism. As we pointed out in earlier conversations, A. Milton Obote created a special force, General Service Unit, and later NASA. These units were ethnically polarized by virtue of public policy, which was based on deliberate ethnic discrimination. Similarly, under Idi Amin, the State Research Bureau, the National Safety Units, and the Army were dominated by specific ethnic groups, which unleashed a state terrorism on the Ugandan population, not unlike what is happening under Museveni. According to Museveni, however, sectarianism in the army was the result of, quote, the military recruitment policy which Obote, as Prime Minister, had inherited from the British in 1962, but which he could have changed. Instead, he expanded it and sought to benefit from it for his personal ambition and sectarian aims. Having consolidated the practice of tribally biased recruitment and promotion, he proceeded to use the army against the parliament, against the constitution, and against the people of Uganda. He even used it against his own political party. It was this tribal, sectarian, and unpoliticized army that eventually overthrew him and intensified the country's political crisis, unquote. So by 1966, the armed forces were becoming more and more sectarian. There was no attempt to ensure that the soldiers were recruited from all parts of Uganda, so that the character and the composition of the nation would be reflected in the army. It is not clear what Museveni means by unpoliticize the army. From the context, however, politicization of the army is a desirable goal, according to Museveni. By politicizing the army has nothing to do with the composition of the army. The two are not the same. An army recruited from all ethnic groups can be politicized. The question for Museveni to answer is, how would politicization of the army affect sectarianism in the army? The concept of sectarianism becomes ambiguous if politicization means indoctrination with specific political doctrines, which Museveni's army has undergone and is still undergoing. Biased ethnic recruitment of the armed forces is not a form of politicizing the armed forces. Judging by the curriculum at Kyankwanzi political school, politicization means political indoctrination and nothing according to one's preferred ideology. No political party holding power at the discretion of the voters should engage in such a practice. The very idea of a democratic multi-party political system is incompatible with a specific regime indoctrinating the army with its own ideology, which Museveni is doing. The army should only have a professional military training and not politicization, as Museveni seems to believe, and actually is doing. Museveni's accusation of Obote of sectarianism, sectarian recruitment of the army, which does not reflect the composition of the nation, should be examined critically from two perspectives. First, an army as a whole may reflect the composition of the nation, but if the top command within which the authority resides does not reflect the national character of the army, one gets the same results of sectarianism in the top ranks of the army, like Museveni's. UPDF's top command structure is sectarian and has been so from the days of Fronasa, recruitment of soldiers in Mbarara area during the war against Amin between February and April 1979. UPDF has always been dominated by officers from Western Uganda. So sectarianism is sectarianism, whether it is within the commanding officers, the rank and file, or the entire army. Secondly, it is in a free and democratic political system, it really does not matter how the army is recruited or composed. The issue of recruitment to reflect the character of the nation only makes sense when the army is viewed as a political instrument. If the purpose of the army is to fight foreign enemies, its composition does not really matter. But if the purpose of the army is to settle internal political scores, in society in the form of state terrorism, then its composition politically matters. The colonial punitive expeditions could only succeed when the armed forces unleashed terror on a population they were not related to. It is both ironical and unfortunate that Museveni's philosophy of the role of the army in society is actually identical to that of Obote and Amin. Museveni's armed forces are as terroristic as those of Obote and Amin armies and the armies should not be used to resolve internal political disputes, intimidate citizens during the elections, or protect an incumbent to hold on to political office. Obote used the army for that purpose, just as Museveni continues to do so today. The charges of sectarianism in the army against Obote by Museveni are malicious, even though they are well-founded. Both Obote and Museveni politicized the army for political purposes. Both forms of politicization of the army lead to the same end of enforcing state terrorism upon the innocent citizens of Uganda. The composition of the army is irrelevant if and when it is deployed to achieve specific political results. Sectarianism, when the army is politically abused in the sense of described above, becomes a meaningless concept. Moreover, you cannot impose ethnic or racial quotas in the recruitment of the army if it is a volunteer army. Volunteer armies may not exist in Africa today, but the process of democratization will make them inevitable. Sectarianism as a negative concept should refer to deliberate discrimination. It becomes irrelevant in a volunteer army recruited without discrimination in a democratic political system. Now, sectarianism in society, briefly. Sectarianism, according to Museveni, was not only to be fought in political parties and the army, but also in society at large. The people to blame for societal sectarianism are the politicians, according to Museveni. Quote, the interests and the needs of the people were, therefore, not made a focal point because opportunistic, ideologically and politically backward politicians had so fragmented society that common interests were lost sight of. The peasant in Lango, northern Uganda, did not regard the peasant in Buganda as his ally. He was persuaded to believe that Baganda were ignorant, while the Baganda were told that the Langi were primitive and cruel. This atomization of the masses into sectarian groups served the interests of the politicians who divided and ruled the people. Sectarianism gave them an automatic and cheap exploitative political base. It is what philosophers call ideological obscurantism, which means obscuring the truth in order to serve the interests of a clique, unquote. Those words belong to Museveni. They are written in the mustard seed. Museveni proposes an astounding solution to societal sectarianism. Apparently, Museveni thinks that ideology, which he does not explicitly define, is the ultimate solution to sectarianism. We reach this conclusion because of the explanation Museveni gives for the causes of societal sectarianism. His first premise is that pre-capitalist polarization based on identity rather than rationality can be extremely injurious to a country. Second, the second premise is that sectarianism is a consequence of an incomplete metamorphosis. In other countries, society has been changing continually. Initially in Europe, from a two-class society of feudal lords and peasants, and by 1789, a four-class society of feudalists, bourgeoisie, or the middle class, the proletarian, urban working class, and the remnants of the peasant class. Now Europe is again basically a two-class society of the middle and the working class. In the United Kingdom, the middle class, made up of professionals and businessmen, make up 52% of the population. The working class makes up 46%, and the upper class 2%. Therefore, it is the metamorphosis society in Europe has gone through several stages in order to reach its present state, just as a butterfly or a cockroach does. The insect's first form of life is an egg, which develops into a larva, then a pupa, and when it matures into a fully fledged butterfly or cockroach, unquote. Well, we have identified the three forms of sectarianism condemned by Museveni. These three forms of sectarianism manifest themselves in different ways in the army, political parties, and society at large. In conclusion, there is no causal relationship between the existence of a specific class configuration and sectarianism. Obviously, colonial security policy was not dictated by class structures in the colonial territories at the time the policies were formulated. The policy was the result of public policy designed to protect the colonial interests. Ethnic or racial discrimination, either in African society or post-colonial armies, was not caused by the existence of specific class configuration, as Museveni erroneously postulates, but by the desire of the post-colonial leaders to achieve specific political and military objectives. For example, the post-colonial leaders used state terrorism to stay in power. The existence of sectarianism in the army was therefore the result of politics and not class configuration as Ugandan society, as Museveni wants us to believe. Moreover, from the comparative perspective, the sectarianism that broke apart Yugoslavia in the 1990s was not caused by class configuration similar to that which existed in Africa, which allegedly, according to Museveni's theory, caused the sectarianism in Uganda and Africa in general. Sectarianism is neither incompatible with the democracy nor necessarily wiped out by the existence of the middle class in any particular society. Sectarianism is in Northern Ireland, in Israel, or India has not prevented democracy from flourishing in those countries where some political parties are based on sectarianism. In USA, the NAACP, the National Advancement of Colored Peoples Association, which could be described as sectarian organization, according to Museveni's concept of sectarian, contributed a lot to the abolition of racial segregation and discrimination in USA, a task that was necessary and positively contributed to fighting racism and discrimination in USA. This objective could only be accomplished by the NAACP, and non-white people would have been worse off without it. People have a right of association in an organization like NAACP in order to fight for their own collective rights violated by discrimination. Therefore, on all accounts, Museveni's concept of sectarianism and social metamorphosis theory are invalid. And we conclude today's conversation on that note. Thank you for listening, and I hope that our analysis of Museveni's concepts of ideology, sectarianism, and other concepts has enlightened you about the way he thinks and explained his politics, which is, for all purposes, very, very deceptive. Thank you for listening. We tune in next week, and we should continue with these conversations.